hate the holidays because you're raising a PDA child or teen. Guess what? I hate them too. It's the worst time of the year for most families raising PDA children or teens, and I am similar. So my husband and I actually call the stretch between Halloween, which is coming up next week, and after my PDA son's birthday in January, the gauntlet in our family, because it's like there's this extra layer and level of escalation, activation, and demands placed on us societally, even if we as parents aren't putting those demands on our children. So today I'm going to kick off Coffee with Casey, hi everybody, with 5 tips for managing Halloween next week, and I'll do a longer live and podcast episode about the holidays in general. Good to see you guys. And we'll have time for questions today because I'm not going to yoga until noon. Okay, so the first thing I want to say about Halloween specifically, but holidays in general, is I think the most foundational shift we can make is shifting our perspective as parents from the Pinterest memory-laden idea of what the holidays should be and actually shift it to being like, the holidays suck and they're going to be bad and it's going to be hard and the kids are going to be more activated and it's not going to look like Pinterest at all. In fact, it's going to be the opposite. So for me, this mindset shift has surprisingly been a tough one because I have always loved the holidays. I've loved the traditions. I've loved the celebrations, all of the, food and decorations. I was super into Halloween and Christmas, etc. as a kid. And I really just had to let that go of like the best moments and memories of my years with my children will not be based around the holidays. Okay. So that's a mindset shift for many of us, because I am training myself, and this is a practice you can use too, to savor ordinary moments for 15 to 30 seconds. So what this might look like is like, I'm walking down the street and there's beautiful sunlight on the leaves in the trees, and I'm walking with one of my kids. And so to train my brain away from negativity bias, I try and breathe in that ordinary moment and savor it, because research shows that you actually have to deliberately savor and put attention on a moment in order to combat the negativity bias where you have 10 positive moments and 1 negative one, and your brain will focus, your survival brain will focus on the negative one. So that's the first mindset shift of just allow it to suck, allow it to be bad, expect that it will be bad, and figure out ways that you can retrain yourself to not be viewing the holidays as the happy memories for your family. The second thing I want to talk about, I sort of have this perspective of holidays, lean in or opt out, no rules. Okay, so those are 3 things. You can either lean into the dopamine, novelty, and excitement in some ways, and you can opt out of other things. And then a reminder that there are no rules. But what that means is, especially for the latter 2, the opting out and no rules, it means it has more to do with setting boundaries and managing other people's perceptions and judgment of you than your child. Okay? So the second thing, the dopamine and novelty. So as we know, one of the main things that can regulate and distract away from the nervous system of a PDA child or teen's constant threat perception is not dopamine and novelty. So in one sense, the holidays can be regulating and exciting and distracting, right? So all of the Halloween costumes, the decorations, the possibility for candy, things are a little bit different because maybe there's a Halloween party and the houses on your block look different. So if you're observing that excitement of the novelty is regulating, you can lean into it. So I'll explain some ways we've leaned into it in my home. So for example, with pumpkins, granted, they're very cheap here in Michigan, we will get and carve pumpkins every weekend, every month in October, right? Of just leaning into that novelty and dopamine. Or we in the past have gone to Goodwill or a place that's, where you can thrift and gotten multiple costumes, right? So you have that constant novelty rather than like picking a costume and sticking with it. Additionally, decorating the house, like from the dollar store, we've leaned into that dopamine and novelty. This might not be the case for your child, especially if they're in burnout, in which case, instead of leaning in, we opt out, right? So we can think of that as lowering demands, okay? So what are ways we have lowered demands? In the past, we have opted out of certain holidays entirely. Just like, we're not doing it. We're not doing the holiday because it's too activating, which really will require boundaries with other people in your life and managing your own discomfort of how people view you more than what you're doing with your child. Okay? But what are some simple ways when we are participating in Halloween, for example, that we have lowered demands? So we've had Halloweens where we've ridden in a car from house to house. We have pulled our son in a wagon and not expected him to walk from house to house. We have never expected him to say trick or treat or thank you. We have opted out of wearing costumes. Okay, so there's lots of ways that we can just lower the demands on our children if we're trick or treating. Hi, everybody. Those are just some examples. We can decide, I would suggest, decide on boundaries ahead of time with your partner or with yourself about like, how much candy are you going to let your child eat? Decide it beforehand of like what level is going to feel comfortable for your family. I know some of you have like allergies or other health issues that your children are dealing with. So like my approach to my son is going to be very different, which might mean in my head, I'm like, okay, I'll probably let him eat like 4 to 5 pieces of candy during trick-or-treating, right? The rule is not going to be stated and it's not going to be a rule. It's just what I'm going to do in response when I see him cross that 4 or 5 threshold. Right? And so the difference between rules and boundaries, rules are like you tell the kid, hey, you can only eat 4 pieces of candy when you're trick-or-treating. And it's stated aloud, it's inflexible, you have to reinforce it, and it will activate your child because it will be a perceived loss of autonomy and you above them, which means activation. A boundary you can keep to yourself, it's flexible, and it has to do with what you do in response to the moment, right? So you're not having that pre-activation. It doesn't mean they won't have a meltdown or activation when you do reinforce the boundary, but it will mitigate some of the activation that is particular to PDA neuroception. So things to think about are how much candy and how late they'll stay up. Then I would say 5th, remember the root cause of what's going on, right? So you guys all know like the dopamine search on Amazon where it's like buying new things all the time, right? So there's also the Amazon wait, which is like you order something on Amazon and then they're waiting for it. And then the excitement and the waiting is actually perceived in their limbic system, their survival brain, as a loss of autonomy and like the wait itself being above them. WAIT, wait. And it activates the nervous system. So Halloween and holidays in general are Amazon waits on steroids, right? Like they're just waiting and waiting for this particular moment in time. It's a huge perceived loss of autonomy that's repeated and repeated. There's also all these societal expectations around like saying please and thank you, saying trick or treat, wearing a costume, that even if they're not reinforced by you, they're going to be perceived as a societal expectation where society is above them or not equal to them, which is activating. So what do we know from this? There's a couple ways we can mitigate this weight. We're not going to get rid of it entirely. I've had many families I've worked with who have practiced trick-or-treating, right? We've done this in our home months before Halloween, where it's like we actually get out the Halloween stuff and we just like play Halloween, and we might even use real candy. But other families I know have practiced on their street where they've even talked to the neighbors about like, hey, my kid is going to be practicing trick or treat. Like, can you help us do this, right? So this can mitigate the weight activation, but it's not necessarily going to get rid of it. Okay. Then the sixth thing I want to say, and while I'm saying this, feel free to drop in some questions, you guys, because this is an interactive Q&A, Coffee with Casey, but I'm just starting it off with Halloween suggestions because I know that it's on many of your minds. I know that many of you are in other locations besides the US, but I think Halloween has gone global. So the sixth and perhaps most important thing, which ties into the first point I made about managing expectations, is be prepared to de-escalate and diffuse as an accommodation, right? So often we think of accommodations like declarative language or strewing or co-regulation or humor as preemptive or lowering demands, preemptive accommodations to support your child's overall nervous system stress. However, we forget that like part of the nervous system disability is activation, right? It's a nervous system disability or difference. So there will be activation, and what we want to do is be prepared to diffuse and de-escalate. So, I expect meltdowns. So I am preparing my own nervous system for that and remembering that I have the tools to de-escalate. And I have a video on YouTube about how to de-escalate. I have one on TikTok. There's also a video here on Instagram on how to de-escalate. But diffusion is when it's not a full-on meltdown and it looks like bad behavior, like whining, controlling, defiance, opposition. And that's the one that parents have the hardest time with, myself included. Okay, so the types of situations you might have of like, let's say you have a boundary of, 5 pieces of candy and we're only staying out until 9, and it's time to reinforce that boundary of like, okay, I've seen that you've already eaten 5 pieces of candy. I'm going to take the rest of these until tomorrow, right? That's a boundary. That's your response to what you're observing as crossing your predetermined boundary. Before a meltdown, you might see things like, but you said we could have 10 pieces of candy, which is not true, right? Like it's just objectively not true. And your child is equalizing because they're trying to get back to a place of nervous system safety when you're setting the boundary. This is just what the disability is, right? They're gonna activate, they're gonna equalize. So instead of saying, no, I didn't say that, you can only have 6 or 5 pieces of candy, and then they'll say, no, you promised I would have 10. And what you're thinking in your head is like, they're lying. I need to teach them what I said. I need to show them that I'm the boss. And all of these internal monologues that you have as a parent are totally normal, but based on the logic of a brain that's not PDA. Okay, so remember that in these moments, even though it's not full-blown meltdown, they are in their survival brain, the red part of the brain, which just means it's operating on a subconscious level, it's reflexive, and it's survival-driven. They also can't learn in the red part of their brain. They can't learn anything. So if you're trying to explain, rationalize, extinguish the behavior, you're just driving them further into the survival brain. So the accommodation becomes diffusion. And that means we're operating from here, we're mammal to mammal, trying to signal safety and get them back into the frontal lobe where they can actually think, access empathy, rational thought, etc. So you might say, what could you say? You could say, I know it felt like you heard me say 10 candies, or like, it's really hard. Your body really wants 10 candies, right? So you're validating and diffusing without getting rid of the boundary, right? So the switch here is just not arguing with them, escalating the power struggle, or trying to explain and get upset with them, but rather just see it as nervous system activation. How can I diffuse this moment and get them back into their frontal lobe? And it might result in a meltdown. It might not work, but prior to full-on de-escalation, we can try and diffuse. Or for example, if your child eats that you see them sneak a 6th candy, and then you're like, I saw you just ate a 6th candy, right? And they're like, no, I didn't. And in your head, you're like, they're lying. I have to teach them not to lie, right? That's a behavior. I need to teach them not to have that behavior, because if I don't, they'll end up being someone who lies, and then they'll never have friends or a job and never be independent. My whole life is over. I get it. It's the 0 to 100 thought process. However, we have to stop it and remember, this is just a reflexive behavior because they're perceiving threat, right? They might not even be conscious of the fact that they're doing it. So instead of arguing with them or trying to be like, you aren't telling the truth, we can simply say like, okay, honey, and then keep the boundary set, right? Like, you don't have to be right. You can diffuse and keep a boundary. Okay, so this is a big mindset shift. It takes a lot of practice. It's something we work on a lot in the Paradigm Shift program. But this is a key accommodation that we work on in all facets of our life. But I'm bringing it to your attention for the Halloween tips so that you can find more peace. At least peace around the fact that, like, you're not doing anything wrong because the holidays are so hard, right? Like, I can't solve for anyone, including my own family, how hard the gauntlet for our family is between Halloween and my son's birthday in January. But what I can do is take off the pressure and the judgment of myself for doing it wrong, right? So in Buddhism, there's something called the second arrow, right? So the first arrow is how much and how difficult the holidays are, how difficult Halloween is when you see everyone else's kids looking great in their homemade costumes, listening to their parents, and you feel it, right? It hurts. But then that's the first arrow. You take the second arrow and you judge yourself of like, what's wrong with me? I'm a bad parent. Why can't the holidays or Halloween look differently? And that's where we suffer more than we need to, right? So take away the second arrow. Know that all of us dislike Halloween and the holidays, and it's not because you're doing anything wrong. It's because you're raising a kid with a nervous system disability. And this is the nature of it. Okay, so Amy's saying, could you tell me more about the Paradigm Shift program? Yeah, absolutely. So this is the signature program that I do. It's the only live offer I have with me and spot coaching outside of my coaching container. So it's a 3-month intensive program where we have a course, right? Like a 3-month course with 10-minute pre-recorded videos with captions and transcripts. And I walk you through what's called the 5A framework, which is my trademarked process to support parents to find peace. And then we have weekly spot coaching calls with me where you can submit questions, and people get off mute and I spot coach in an audience. There's a private podcast and there's a moderated online community with some other coaches to support you, because I get empathy overwhelm if I'm in there too much. I've learned that after doing this now 6 times. And it's a 3-month live container, but then you get lifetime access to the community, the alumni community, and the private podcast, and all the pre-recorded stuff that I have put out ever. So it's like a comprehensive offer. And it's really, so I share all the information freely, but the Paradigm Shift program is implementation and belonging. Right? So like, you can know all the information on something, you can read all the books, but like how to actually implement it in a supportive community, and a sense of belonging, which can be healing, that's the design of the program. So it's like the how to actually make the transformation. Okay, so great question. Love to see you there. You can jump on the wait list in my link in bio. And I'm just heading back to the beginning to see if people have questions. Okay, it's good to see you guys. Thank you for the waves. I appreciate it. And sorry, there's like a leaf blower outside of my house. Raising a wildflower. A little wildflower. Why does my 4-year-old flip-flop constantly? She says, I do, I don't, I do, I don't, I do, I don't. Constantly or push something away when she wants it right back. Yeah, this will continue for 10 minutes. Okay, so this sounds like a cognitive loop, or you can think of it like this. Our children are children. Our teens are teens, right? They have temperaments, they have desires, they have likes, they have special interests, right? And so there's one part of their brain, which is the conscious, rational frontal lobe, which is like, I want to play this video game, or I want to draw this color, I want to color with this, or I need your help to cut something with scissors, right? That's the rational part of the brain. But then as soon as the video game starts winning against them, or as soon as they're not coloring as much as inside the lines as they would like, or as soon as you go to help them, what happens? The red part of their brain activates, the subconscious perception of threat, survival part, okay? Why? Because the video game is beating them, so they perceive they're not equal to the game, and it tells their subconscious, hey, you're gonna die. So it's like avoidance or opposition or fight flight, or coloring. They like coloring. They're a kid who likes coloring, but then they see that they're going outside of the lines. And then there's this perception, either a loss of autonomy because there's the expectation that they stay in the lines, or that there's an internal loss of equality because they can't make their body do exactly what they want. And so the subconscious is activating. So it's like literally like going back and forth between these two parts. Oops. Back and forth. I do, I don't. Or like when they ask for help. Frontal lobe asks for help. Hey, can you help me cut this? You move to help them and they hit your hand away. And then you try and help again. They're like, help me. And they hit your hand away and you're like, I can't help you if you're pushing me away. But it's like frontal lobe wants help. Survival brain says no, because then they perceive you're above them. Right? So this is super hard to manage, especially when your kids are young, because like they're also developmentally developing here that awareness, right? This part of the brain develops until we're like 25, and with neuroplasticity continues. So like that's good news for all of us as parents of PDA children and teens. However, there's also the developmental aspect of a 4-year-old, right? So it's like double whammy. It's something that I've observed in my own son, with families I've worked with. It's a cognitive loop, or just like, especially if you're involved with it, it's just like that moving back and forth between the two parts of the brain that you can really see how, stuck they get. Do you have a sense of what part of the country world is most supportive of PDA? It's a great question. When I started my journey, and long before I started this business, I always perceived the UK as being the most supportive, because they have the PDA Society and they have all this peer-reviewed journal work that's coming out of there, so more research. But then when I've worked with families from the UK, or they're in my programs or email me, it's like they perceive that here in the US is more like aware and accommodating. For me, I think Australia is the most supportive, because you guys have the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that actually will compensate parents for like taking a program with me. And there's, occasionally Canada gets reimbursement, but it depends on the province. But like in terms of actual support, I think Australia is probably the most progressive. That's my perception. I don't get the sense that there's a big amount of awareness or support here in the United States, but, people always say there's not as much awareness in my country as there is in the US, and so I don't know for sure. But yeah, I would say Australia. Like if I had to pick a country, I would say Australia. Just from like running my business and seeing who gets reimbursed, and seeing, officially who actually gets money from the government to support PDA, it's Australia. Yeah. This is gold. I never thought about it like this. Oh, I'm so glad, Valerie. I'm so glad. It's a fear they will become a narcissist for me like my son's dad. Okay, so that's a common fear, but let me alleviate it for you. Okay? So this is my perspective. And I had those fears too. Our children have a nervous system disability, right? Where every time their subconscious perceives that they don't have control. Okay, think about it like this. I'm going to get a little wonky for a second. Okay? Let's talk about polyvagal theory. Polyvagal theory is evolutionarily based. Okay? So the idea is reptiles had this fight, flight, or freeze that they would immediately go into without a down regulation of that survival response. Why? Because reptiles, lizards, they lay eggs and they don't live in community and tribes and groups like monkeys do, right? I'm oversimplifying it. Evolutionarily speaking, mammals developed so that they had to care for their young, they lived in groups, and they had safe and social practices. So they evolved to have a vagal pathway that down-regulates or turns off that immediate fight or flight or freeze. Okay? So in order to be in safe and social, in order to empathize, in order to take perspective of the other person and connect, which are all things that narcissists can't do, we have to be in what's called ventral vagal. We have to be in a state where our subconscious and our mammalian self perceives that we are safe to down-regulate our survival instincts. Okay? Because if our brain perceives that we're not safe, we're just always going to be in fight or flight or freeze. Okay? So with PDA children, there are two things going on. They have the neuroception of threat constantly, right? So, and they're not aware of it because it's happening from the subconscious. Okay? Additionally, I believe that they can't effectively down-regulate that vagal pathway that mammals have. So when they do get activated, they stay in activation, okay? So if a PDA child or teen is constantly in that activation, right? What does it look like? It looks like controlling behavior because they're trying to get back to a place of nervous system safety. It looks like fight, flight, which is opposition, aggression, right? It looks like shutdown, which can look like avoidance and not taking perspective or empathy. That's all happening in the nervous system, okay? So if we approach that of like, I have to stop this behavior. I don't want my child to keep being controlling like this. And we punish and we explain and we rationalize. It's just driving them deeper into the nervous system and survival response. Okay? And it cuts off connection. It cuts off empathy. It literally puts them in the reptilian part of their brain. Okay? It might look like they're complying and fine in the moment, but it's just turning it into a freeze response. Over time, I believe if they're not supported, accommodated, if they don't have a development of like how their nervous system works, they just exist in this complete reptilian brain space of not being safe, okay? Versus us recognizing that this is going on, and even though it feels counterintuitive, accommodating that nervous system to keep putting them back into their frontal lobe, where scientifically they can access empathy, connect, regulate their nervous system, take perspective. Okay, so those two scenarios, even though in the short term with this one, it's going to look like worse behavior, controlling behavior, demanding things from you that feel abusive. Well, so short term, the one where you're using behavioral approaches, it might look like you're extinguishing the behavior. So maybe for 5 years, this one looks like it works. And for 5 years, you feel like you're raising an abusive narcissist. But over the long term, I believe with my whole heart, brain, and soul that this scenario of accommodating, developing self-awareness, connecting, continually getting them out of their survival brain makes it so much less likely that they're going to be abusive or narcissistic, right? But in the moment, what we're seeing is the nervous system response, which parallels the indicators of an adult narcissist. But the narcissist is one who's traumatized, who doesn't have connection and can't take empathy or perspective because they're just in their nervous system. I'm not validating the behavior. I'm just saying I truly believe the logic. And I've seen this. Like, I've seen this with my own son, where like I used to think he was abusive. He would end up in an institution, hospitalized, or in prison. But I believed, and I took a leap of faith on the logic. And I also believe, because of my spiritual practice, that like innately we have an inner light that cannot be corrupted, right? And so like ultimately it's a practice of how can we peel back the layers of the nervous system, of the threat response, which is not who our children are, in order to access that light, right? And like 4 years later, I can clearly see that my son is a good kid, right? He still has moments of activation and equalizing behavior and controlling, and sometimes it pings that worry for me, but like he's a totally different kid than he was 4 years ago. And if I hadn't trusted that, maybe he would have for a period looked more compliant and not abusive because I made him go get his own popcorn. But down the road, I believe he would have been a totally traumatized and potentially suicidal and mentally ill human, right? And that's what I care about. I care about him when he's 30. I don't care if he's like saying please and thank you with his grandparents. No offense, Mom. You know this story. So I don't believe that if we prioritize nervous system safety, connection, getting our kids back into the frontal lobe so we can model for them how to manage their disability and speak with them about what's actually going on in their nervous system and give them a sense that they're not bad, that we're much less likely to have narcissists, right? I mean, I think maybe a lot of narcissists are PDA individuals who are undiagnosed and, you know, end up with no connection, existing totally in a controlling space, no self-awareness, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I do believe that there are narcissists and that you should absolutely set boundaries and get out of that. But like this is something that comes up a lot in my programs of like ex-spouses who are undiagnosed PDA and or narcissistic. And like, I have a lot of empathy for that because the moms who are trying to implement these accommodations, it's like super activating to their nervous system. And there's this huge worry about like, am I just creating another version of what I just escaped from? And like, it's a huge leap, you know, and we obviously meet the mom where she is, and some of the accommodations like the diffusion and the de-escalation are going to be harder because it's ingrained in her nervous system that this is what she experienced with her ex-spouse or partner. And so we adjust, right? We might focus more on declarative language. We might focus more on her nervous system. So it's not a blanket approach. And obviously, like if you have relationship trauma, diffusion and delivering food and all that stuff, if you're doing it in your previous relationship, are going to be harder to access, right? And that's okay. And we can bring that to light and recognize and acknowledge it. And also focus on practicing trusting that like our child is not who we married, right? For better or worse, like there's nurture and there's nature. And I believe for a long time I was like, well, there's no nurture because no matter what I do, my kid is just responding in the same way. And for a long time I felt that way. But over years, I think the families I work with, and myself included, see the shifts. And this is why, like, I did the workshop Progress with PDA, and one of the indicators we look at is connection, right? But not like these big overnight changes of just like, oh, instead of kicking me off the couch, my son put his feet under my leg for the first time in a year, right? Like that's where we see the progress, and that's those indicators that we can track, which if you're interested, I would go into Progress with PDA. It's $95. It's like such a good price, I think, because it's like, I don't know, 8 hours of content, you get a workbook, all the things. You can actually track empirically how this approach works. So you don't just have to trust from like 4-year-old to 30-year-old that like eventually it will work. Like if you pay attention to the right indicators of basic needs, connection, and nervous system activation, you can see that behind the threat response, there's a really good person. So that's my perspective. Sorry, that was a very long answer. It's something I think about a lot, and I don't think I've talked about it on a live. So there you go. Okay. Let's see. How can we better support our children at school the week before Halloween and the day with special activities? Okay, so it depends again, like, Jesse, are you in the leaning in camp or the opting out camp, right? So it depends on, is your child sort of like activated by all the novelty and the demands around having to put on a costume, you know, like do things with pumpkins? If so, then we want to use communication with the school about lowering those demands so that the child can opt out of them. If the child is really excited and fueled by dopamine and novelty and really focused on Halloween, we can communicate what's going on, that this is part of their nervous system activation, and potentially incorporate, you know, special little things around the Halloween stuff to make them feel equal to or even a little bit above the other kids as an accommodation, which I know feels not fair, but we're talking about equity here in terms of nervous system disabilities. So, but if we're panning out, I also want to just say there are no rules, right? Like if none of the rules, institutions, medical, therapeutic, or educational spaces support your kids, then you get to just opt out. Like you get to decide. And like I had to learn this myself when we were in the pandemic and my son was enrolled in the public school and they wouldn't give him accommodations and wanted me to like physically restrain him to sit in front of the computer, to be counted for his attendance, and like spoke about child protective services on our IEP calls. And I just realized like I get to be in control here. Like I am not doing this, right? So, you know, a lot of this is tapping back into our agency and setting boundaries as parents. I know there's advocacy involved, but you're allowed to like keep your kid home if like a day of Halloween celebrations is too much for them. I just want to give you that permission. Could helping a younger child regulate their nervous system help them with later stress or more severe effects on them of PDA? 100%. Yeah. I think like, so co-regulation in the sense of like mammal to mammal signaling safety is teaching their body to feel safe. Okay, so it doesn't mean they're not going to activate. It just means they're learning how it feels to down-regulate and come back to regulation or safe and social. Where we get tripped up is when we think of self-regulation as a skill, right? Of like, you need to learn self-regulation. The only way to do it is like if you know, I'm gonna make you go to this thing because you need to learn to self-regulate, and the only opportunity you have is if you're exposed. Versus making sure we're not pushing them to go do something that puts them in their survival brain where they can't down-regulate, right? We're lowering the demand, and then we're focusing on the nervous system safety. And absolutely, I think that they can learn to feel the signals of safety and recognize the signals of safety and create over the long term the signals of safety, which all of us can do, right? Through nervous system practices, meditation, etc. The thing is, it takes a long time, right? Like, we, for the first 4 years of my son's life, had no idea that there was anything distinct from a neurotypical child. So we approached him, first 4.5, with traditional parenting and 1, 2, 3 timeouts and punishment, all that stuff, right? Like, the normal stuff. Like, if you don't eat this food at the table, you can't have dessert, right? But for 4.5 years, his body was experiencing trauma around that, right? So for the next 4 years, which is now almost 4.5, it's been undoing that process of like his body having this nervous system disability and then me responding in a way that deepens that sense of inescapability, right? Which can cause trauma. So it's like, it doesn't happen over the course of like 6 months, right? It's like, if we've been doing things through one paradigm for 6 years, we might need another 6 years until we truly see a totally different outcome. And it's a practice, right? It's a daily process and a practice. And like, I know that's not sexy. I know it's not easy to get on board with, but like, if you can find meaning in that process, then I think it just becomes part of your life. So yes, I'm super optimistic for these kids. Yeah. Is there a date where PDA started to be more acknowledged? I'm thinking 2013, but not sure where I got that date from. It's just a time frame a bit to interested people to explain. Okay, so I think the reason you're getting that 2013 date is because that's when the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, shifted to include pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified and Asperger's in the autism spectrum. So that shift from like autism to autism in the DSM-5 meant that areas where PDAers were being diagnosed otherwise outside of the autism spectrum, like PDD, NOS, and Asperger's, or, ODD is not part of it, but like those two categories got scooped into autism in 2013. The first awareness of it was with Elizabeth Newson in the 80s, and that was PDD, NOS. But I think it's very recent, like in the last 5 years, that it's becoming more and more recognized from the work of autistic advocates, from PDA North America, PDA Society. I'm thinking back to like when I started my first podcast, like, I know he's problematic, but like Harry Thompson's book, PDA Paradox, had just come out, and like, there was the first conference in the US with PDA North America, I think 4 years ago. So, in the last 5 years, I think things have really shifted. And shifting. You are so welcome. You are so welcome. Okay, I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to jump off. It's been so fun to be with you guys. Okay, daughter hasn't been to school for 3 years. Low demand accommodations for over a year. She still struggles massively to engage with any professionals, leave the house, bath, brush teeth. Will this change? I don't know. I don't know. I think one thing I'm going to give to you, Miss B, is something I work on with my coaching containers sometimes, and I've been through myself, and I think it can be a very triggering but transformational practice, so I'm going to give you it. Anyone can take it from here. What I'm here to help parents with is to find peace and stability so that their child can be the best version of who they are. Some PDA children will be more disabled throughout their life and others won't. I can't predict that, right? Like that is not under our control. And so the practice becomes, if nothing changes, if my life stays exactly the same, and I went through this practice myself, how would I change my life in the areas that I can change? And what would I let go of to find peace in this static state, right? So this is one of the reasons I started my business, because I initially thought, as soon as I get this under control, I'm going to go back to my career, right? Like get it under control. And so I was constantly waiting for it to be different. And then I remember finally radically accepting, like, okay, this might not change. This might be my life, raising a kid with a disability. And so what am I going to do to find joy in my life? And it started out very simply with like 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. every morning. I got to write and work on the PDA Parents website and podcast, which was my previous project. It's still up. You can see it. I did it with another mom. There's a podcast. Because I was like, well, I want to find some meaning, right? But here's the kicker. This is where the radical acceptance comes in. As soon as we truly let go and accept, like, this is what my reality is, and really grieve it and like see it and accept it and stop avoiding it and let it through without judgment and with compassion for ourselves, things start to shift energetically within us. And often that ripples out into the home. So like if we stay on the surface of all the doing, sometimes we get stuck, right? Of like, I'm doing all the accommodations, I'm lowering all the demands, I'm waiting until this stops. Like there's an energetic field around your life that's like still trying to control the outcome. And this is a little bit spiritual, but like I started to find true peace when I let go of an outcome, right? And this is also something we work on in the Paradigm Shift program. And there's a ton of grief in there. Like there's a ton of grief because you're finally realizing and accepting, I'm raising a kid with a nervous system disability. And like, we think we're accepting it, but we're not, right? And like, that's going to be super triggering to a lot of people listening to this. But I will say, with the families I've worked with and those who have gone through my programs, like that is what transforms, right? Accepting the constraints is what allows you to transcend them. So I will leave you with that. I hope it's helpful. And I will see you guys next week on another Coffee with Casey. All right, guys. Bye.